Do you guys think intelligence makes things difficult? So here I'm talking to people who do identify as being highly intelligent, highly creative perhaps. Do you think that intelligence makes things difficult? And if so, how does it make things difficult? So this is kind of a trick question because in a sense, to say what I think, intelligence is already about creating finer and finer nuances and more distinctions between whatever it is that you're examining mentally. And more distinctions means more concepts, it means more points of contrast, it means more points of comparison, it means more points of measurement. It can mean all these things. And a little thought exercise for you, if you feel yourself to have always been kind of above average intelligent, can you remember what age you were when you first started to notice that difference and what was going on? Like, what did it feel like? Can you take yourself back to that time and to the thoughts you were telling yourself, the stories that you were telling yourself about what difference this was between you and your family members or some of your close friends? For example, like, did your parents ever say, oh, you're just making things complicated? Like, why are you overcomplicating this? Or people said, I would never have thought of that. And all that is that you're bringing in more awareness to whatever it is in your experience. You're bringing in like a higher degree of light intensity, a higher degree of focus, probably a greater depth of memory, so you can make larger comparisons. You can draw more historical comparisons or with more specificity when you have a greater capacity for deep memory, especially, which is what draws on your own internal experience. And notice how none of that is really necessary, maybe just beyond like a super minimal level even, for just being an organism who survives in the world, even in the human world. As we all know, when you think about it from the other direction, deep memory is not required of anyone. It is not even, I would say, it is not even encouraged. And if you have seen my other videos, I've talked about this a lot. It's fragmentation, which is encouraged, and then it's placed on, the burden of that is placed back on the individual, which arguably creates even more fragmentation. And so one of the reasons I started thinking about this was a post someone shared on Instagram telling that common trope about how all the smart people she knew from high school or from college are now doing like things that are like grossly undervalue their intelligence or potential. So the guy who did math at MIT is now like bartending in Florida and so on. And I think there's some element of, there's like a nugget of truth in here, but it's not being correctly articulated. And there's also other factors involved with like that type of situation. The first being the path of authenticity. So once you start on a very authentic path, you may make decisions that you didn't foresee because they're not part of a script that you might have been following. The other point is that that kind of trope is just not really, it's not like a strong truth. Like, there are a ton of people who were like, consistently brilliant then and now, and they're in brilliant careers, or they still have like amazing success. So that trope is definitely not even like a strong truth. But let's address the nugget of it that is true, that people are trying to comment on when they observe these things. And I think this comes down to, in large part, well, two parts actually. So first of all, absolutely anyone can succumb to learned helplessness or fall into, I don't like this phrase actually, a victim mindset. I don't think that phrase actually works well anymore. Like, it's not helpful. It's like more accurate even to just talk about like learned helplessness. Again, that can happen to anyone. It can happen quite innocently even. if you fall ill, you are disabled, whatever number of like traumas may happen to you over a short period of time. So all kinds of things can happen, right? We know that. There's many reasons why someone can become stuck, but the more specific nugget of truth in here, I think, and I don't know if I'd ever really like put these two side by side previously, but basically, some of it could be about the distinction that Carol Dweck made when she wrote the book Mindset. The research that went into this basically showing the effective differences between having a so-called fixed versus growth mindset. So someone who is naturally gifted, someone who is born like obviously highly intellectually gifted, there is an innate component to that. Whether, this kind of thing can come in from other lifetimes. We don't really understand the complexity of something being innate yet. It's not just genetics. But I think it was her who talked about how if you were told so frequently as a child growing up about how smart you are and you were getting straight A's and a lot of things came really easily to you in those early years, because face it, a lot of things are pretty simple then, like in terms of like what you have to learn in education. We're going through the easy levels. It doesn't get hard yet. And so if you have a fixed mindset and then you move into some really challenging situation in life, some set of circumstances that are completely new, and on top of like all the additional stress in adulthood and whatever else you're navigating, whatever other surprises you're navigating, you may easily default to beliefs like, okay, something is wrong with me because if I have this innate type of gift or intelligence or ability, why is it not working? And these kinds of beliefs. Whereas other people may have been raised with conditioning that was more about teaching them that they would be able to learn anything they needed to. You can figure this out. Maybe it takes a little bit of extra work. Maybe it will go slower than you think for a while, but like you can do it, basically. You can do it. And so the growth there is something that you achieve. It's like something outside of you, and it's a process you go through. It's a set of actions you need to take. Whereas the fixed mindset is referring to, this innate quality, like this implicit idea that you don't have to reach, you don't have to do anything additional necessarily in order to grow. And so part of her point was that even in people who are like averagely intelligent, averagely gifted, perhaps, if that's even accurate to talk about it that way, but if they had parents or an environment that nurtured and created a growth mindset for them, they can go on to accomplish like incredible things, incredible periods of intellectual growth that may not be reflected in very highly innately gifted individuals. So it's not like an exact mapping onto giftedness, but it could be a component in these types of stories. But there's another aspect here that I'll mention that I think could be a factor in these kinds of cases, and that is that there is an element to giftedness in at least some individuals, perhaps, who pursue it. Perhaps it's giftedness with a growth mindset. Perhaps it's giftedness with like scoring really high on openness. And that is like the role of intuition, and it's also deeply tied to the workings of intelligence. Not necessarily, not everyone is accessing intuition or working with it explicitly, but if you're highly intelligent and you do, you're probably more likely to try to follow it, to test it out, to take it seriously. And that can also lead to, and if you're doing that, you care about authenticity, right? That's why you're doing it. Authenticity will be, if not like an explicit core value, it's just something so ingrained that, you're on that path no matter what. So this guy who did math at MIT and then moved down to Florida to do some bartending. I mean, any number of things could have been happening, right? He could have been following a kind of like intuitive nudge about the location he was supposed to be in for meeting certain people. The thing with this type of giftedness, once it starts moving into that level, which I will call it's something transpersonal, it's something that's the essence of spiritual, and you start moving into higher contexts, wider contexts, contexts that are bringing things together that the average person is not bringing together. Like, that's why you'll hear comments like, what does that have to do with this? Or why would you bring that up, like, in this context, from people who don't see the connections very easily. Maybe they're not really wired to see wider connections. But when you're working with intuition in this way, in this deep way, those kinds of connections can come very instantaneously, like little flashes of lightning, and highly charged with meaning, personal meaning to you. And if you're that type of intellectually gifted, you're apt to take that seriously, I think, and at least test it out. So if you're new here, I've done so many videos on this, and I'll link to that playlist like right here. But yeah, definitely check out some of my earlier videos if you want any more context on, some of the angles that I'm taking on this topic. And especially the one I did, like, I think last week, which is on this idea of some people being too smart for their own good and kind of just getting stuck in their own accounts of the world and what's really going on with that. So definitely check that out too. That can also be part of this. It's part of the learned helplessness, and maybe like the specifically gifted variety, because your own intelligence can work against you, like rationalizing all the things, all the reasons why you can't do this yet because you can't do that, and so on. And I think the reason why this post or this story kind of like caught my attention is the way in which it kind of like, it's like pulling up weeds, right? And you think you're like pulling up one weed, but it's actually connected to so many things. So the way this person presented it was like super underdetermined, because it was like connected to so many things. And even now, like, I've noticed there's even like the whole component of like the role of the matrix that plays into this. So I have a video on that, or a few videos actually that are really good that you should check out. And basically, like, if you're familiar probably with the idea that there's like a scale of emotions or emotional frequencies that we can move up and down on. So at the very bottom are like the worst frequencies, are like toxic shame and self-hate or hate. And then at the very top is like joy, and I don't know, I think joy is maybe the highest usually. But there's an intellectual scale too, and somewhere, so this is really interesting, because the intellect can start to like descend in a way from its more exalted functions, and then it can kind of like it starts dropping into like just being clever, like using your intellect to kind of like show off your intellect, and that's it, like knowing the right references, knowing like the like the slang, knowing like the certain, just these knee-jerk kinds of like reactions and concepts. And it can drop further though into like really dropping into like a kind of certain kind of sarcasm, and then down into like cynicism, which is where like the learned helplessness lies. But here it's like really bolstered by that ability to be so clever, right? Like, you can, like a spider web, like weave any account you want to like keep you in this cage. And then that could even be getting close into, like, I'll step out on a limb here, but that's getting close into something like schizophrenia, where your mind is kind of like creating the reality against you. Like, it's fragmenting, it's not doing the normal type of perceptual and conceptual binding. And so there's an intellectual scale also, a mental scale perhaps is what we should say. And this is really another topic, but I think that moving upwards in the mental scale is really about like when you can start like really integrating your mental activities with your like heart consciousness. And this would require like another discussion, I guess, but this is the path where you start blending in your intuition, your receptivity, and the role of the intellect in these higher levels as you get higher, I think, is about really moving through a phase where you're really discerning like the language of your own intuition, the language of like your psychic landscape, the symbols that your psyche wants to use for you. I was talking about the resource archetype in one of my recent videos too, and that's part of this. So I think my message here for anyone listening, if you're in a similar position or you recognize yourself in any of this, I would say it's this piece of like heart healing, emotional healing that can bring your intelligence back working for you. If you feel that it's working against you, if you feel like you are in a place of like being too smart for your own good, or a kind of the so-called gifted burnout, or like, why did God make me this way if I can't, use my intelligence in like find the job that works with it? Because you're probably receiving a lot of intuitions, and you need a certain level of like courage, strength of heart, to be able to take the kinds of risks that would allow you to act on those and to integrate it with what you do know. And as a mentor of mine once mentioned, a very valuable insight is that the more you, well, I'm going to really paraphrase and probably add a little bit to this, but basically, the more that you can act on your own from like a heart-centered place of moving forward, like a really authentic path, like taking that risk, the more you can do that, the less you will be caught up in projections, which is like part of the thing that can keep you stuck. Because you may end up projecting things like, oh, this person doesn't really care, this group doesn't really want to help me, oh, this isn't going to work, this looks exactly like the other thing that hurt me. But if you've been able to find your authentic, like heart-centered path, even if that doesn't have like a name or clear steps or even a clear direction, when you're walking it, and with the moves that you're making, the actions you're taking, if you at least have that, that's like a huge gift. That's really the gift, the central gift. And it'll be much easier for you to move back into a place of gratitude when you have that. That kind of like helps you really weather like whatever may happen anyway. And so it kind of like, it gives you a strength that you can use to like, overcome and push through like a lot of these risks or perceived risks or threats. And really, that's like going to be the path of integration. So I hope that helps. I hope there's been some insight in there for some of you. This has been a real like walking meditation. As I said, I wanted to go fishing in the David Lynchian sense, and I think I found a few things. I think brought together like most of the things I've been talking about now for like at least over the last couple of months for sure. So yeah, let me know what you think, or of this like new like messy video format that I'm testing out. And I'll be back soon and we'll talk again. So I'll see you guys in the comments. Let me know what you think. Yeah, and subscribe if you haven't yet, and check out some of my earlier videos. Thanks.